The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet suburban street as General Thomas Wills, a highly decorated African-American war hero, drove through in his sleek black SUV. The vehicle's polished surface reflected the vibrant autumn colors lining the road. Dressed in his full military uniform, adorned with medals of valor, General Wills exuded a sense of pride and accomplishment. He was en route to surprise his mother with a visit, the anticipation of her joy bringing a smile to his face. Lost in thoughts of his mother's delight and the stories he'd share, he didn't immediately notice the flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. The sound of the siren jolted him out of his reverie. Confused, he glanced down at the speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His vehicle was in impeccable condition. There was no apparent reason for being pulled over. General Wills inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Years of discipline and military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but he was acutely aware of the stories. The countless instances where routine traffic stops spiraled into something far worse. He placed his hands firmly on the steering wheel, a silent reminder to himself to comply and keep the situation under control. The patrol car came to a stop behind him, and a tall, broad-shouldered white police officer stepped out. The officer, whose name tag read D. Price, adjusted his belt and approached with an air of authority. His expression was unreadable, but his movements were brisk and deliberate. Price's voice was curt as he barked, "Step out of the vehicle." General Wills rolled down his window, meeting the officer's gaze. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask the reason for the stop?" His tone was calm, professional, even courteous. Price's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. "I said, step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his hand hovering near the holster of his sidearm. The aggression in his tone was unmistakable. Wills hesitated for a brief moment. "Of course, officer," he said evenly, unbuckling his seatbelt and opening the door. He stepped out slowly, ensuring his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. The medals on his uniform caught the sunlight, their brilliance a stark contrast to the officer's cold demeanor. Price's gaze lingered on the uniform, but didn't soften. Instead, his suspicion seemed to deepen. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Wills straightened his posture, his towering frame unintentionally intimidating. "I'm on my way to visit my mother, who lives just a few streets away," he replied, his tone remaining measured. "You got any drugs in the car? Weapons?" Price's questions came rapid fire, his hand still hovering near his gun. The accusation in his voice was palpable, as if he had already made up his mind about the man standing before him. "No, officer," Wills said firmly but respectfully. "My identification and vehicle registration are in the glove compartment, if you'd like to see them." Price ignored the offer, stepping closer. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his tone dripping with distrust. "Actually, I grew up in this area," Wills responded. His patience was wearing thin, but he refused to let it show. Years of military service had taught him the importance of maintaining composure, even in the face of hostility. Price's lips curled into a sneer. "I'll ask the questions. You'll answer them." "Got it." The situation was escalating rapidly. Wills could feel the weight of the officer's prejudice bearing down on him. He glanced around, noticing a few curious onlookers slowing their cars or pausing on the sidewalk. The tension in the air was palpable. "Officer," Wills began, his voice steady but firm, "I have nothing to hide. If you'd like, I can provide identification and proof of my intentions." But Price wasn't interested in explanations. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," he ordered. His hand finally gripped his gun, and the intent was clear. The decorated general, a man who had served his country with honor and bravery, now found himself facing a battle he hadn't prepared for. The fight against the very prejudice and ignorance he had sworn to protect his nation from. As he complied, the reality of the situation settled over him like a heavy weight. This was not the battlefield he had trained for, but it was a fight he couldn't afford to lose. The heat of the asphalt burned against General Thomas Will's knees as Officer Daniel Price shoved him down with unnecessary force. Around him, a small but growing crowd began to gather, their concerned whispers turning into audible protests. Phones were raised, cameras capturing the humiliating spectacle of a decorated war hero treated like a common criminal. "What's he doing?" "He's in uniform," a young man called out, his voice shaking with disbelief. "This isn't right," added a middle-aged woman, clutching her purse tightly as if to hold herself back from intervening. Price ignored the rising commotion. With his knee pressed firmly into Will's back, he leaned in closer, his voice a sneer. "Stay down and don't move," he growled, as if addressing an unruly suspect rather than a man of honor. Will struggled to keep his composure. Every breath was a challenge under the officer's weight, but years of military discipline kept him focused. He tried again to reason with the officer. "I am General Thomas Wills, United States Army. Please, let me show you my identification." Price's face twisted into a mocking grin. "Oh," a general, "huh? Do you think I'm stupid? Nice try." His words dripped with condescension, and the crowd reacted audibly, their murmurs growing louder. "Let him up," a woman shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "You're going too far. This is America, not a war zone," another voice added, as people began stepping closer to the unfolding drama. Despite their outrage, no one dared physically intervene, fearing the consequences of confronting an armed officer. Will's heart ached, not just from the physical pressure, but from the bitter humiliation. This wasn't a foreign battlefield, where he'd fought valiantly for his country. This was his home, and yet he felt more vulnerable here than he ever had overseas. The very uniform that symbolized his sacrifices and achievements seemed powerless to protect him now. "What's he done?" a teenager asked, his phone steady as he recorded the scene. Price barked without turning his head. "Back up, all of you. This is a police matter." But the crowd was no longer silent. Their frustration boiled over into shouts of indignation. "He's not resisting. You're abusing your power. Shame on you." Despite the cacophony around him, Price's grip on the situation remained firm, or so he thought. The rising tension seemed to embolden him rather than deter him. He reached for his radio, but before he could speak into it, a voice from the crowd cut through the chaos. "Do you even know who he is?" The voice belonged to an older man, his face lined with both years and wisdom. He stepped forward cautiously, his expression stern. "That's General Thomas Wills, a war hero. Show some respect." For the first time, Price hesitated. His eyes flicked to Will's uniform, the medals gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The officer's expression faltered for a split second before his arrogance returned. "Anyone can put on a uniform," he muttered. Wills lifted his head slightly, his voice clear despite the strain. "Call your supervisor." "I insist." Price's hand froze over his radio, torn between doubling down on his authority and addressing the growing unease of the crowd. The murmurs around him had turned into an undeniable force. "Yeah, call your boss," someone yelled, prompting others to echo the demand. Still, Price hesitated, his grip on Wills loosening slightly. The officer's confidence was cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. Finally, another siren pierced the tense atmosphere, and a second patrol car sped onto the scene. The crowd's collective attention shifted, and a wave of hope rippled through the onlookers. The new arrival parked hastily, and out stepped Lieutenant Paul Marshall, a senior officer with a commanding presence. Marshall's eyes widened as he took in the scene. Wills, face pressed to the pavement, Price hovering over him, and an angry crowd recording every moment. His jaw tightened as he approached swiftly. "Officer Price, stand down immediately." Marshall's voice was sharp, his authority slicing through the chaos like a knife. Price hesitated but obeyed, stepping back as Marshall reached down to help Wills to his feet. The general stood, brushing dirt off his uniform, his posture still dignified despite the ordeal. "General Wills, Marshal asked, his tone laced with both shock and respect. "Yes, Lieutenant," Wills replied, his voice steady but weary. Marshal turned to Price. Fury etched on his face. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This man is a decorated officer of the United States Army." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers of support for Wills, their relief palpable. Price, pale and visibly shaken, opened his mouth to respond but was cut off. "We'll deal with this later," Marshal snapped before turning back to Wills. "General, I am so sorry for this. Please accept my sincerest apologies." Wills nodded, his face composed but his eyes heavy with emotion. The crowd's applause grew louder, their support echoing through the street as Marshal led Wills toward his vehicle. The ordeal was over, but its impact would linger. Lieutenant Paul Marshall's piercing gaze swept across the chaotic scene as he stepped out of his patrol car. The gathered crowd fell silent, their murmurs giving way to an air of expectancy. His sharp features were set in a grim expression, his body language exuding both authority and indignation. "Officer Price, stand down," Marshal ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Price froze, his hand still hovering over his holster. For a moment, it seemed he might defy the command, but then he reluctantly stepped back, releasing his grip on General Thomas Wills. The officer's posture sagged slightly, as if realizing the gravity of the situation he had created. Wills pushed himself upright with dignity, brushing dirt off his immaculate military uniform. The medals adorning his chest caught the sunlight, gleaming as a stark contrast to the humiliation he had just endured. Despite his weariness, he held his head high, his composure unshaken. Marshall's eyes widened as recognition dawned. "General Wills?" he asked, his tone shifting to one of astonishment and respect. Wills met his gaze, nodding. "Yes, Lieutenant," he said, his voice calm but tinged with exhaustion. For a brief moment, the two men exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They had once served together, their shared experiences forged in the crucible of war. Marshall's expression hardened as he turned to Price, who was now visibly pale. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Marshall demanded, his voice rising. He gestured to Wills with a sharp motion. "This is General Thomas Wills, a decorated war hero. He's risked his life for this country more times than you can count. What were you thinking?" Price's mouth opened and closed, his stammered response incoherent. He looked suspicious. "I thought—" "You thought wrong." Marshall cut him off, his words laced with contempt. He took a step closer to Price, who seemed to shrink under his superior's glare. "You didn't follow procedure. You let prejudice cloud your judgment. And now, you've disgraced this department." The crowd's murmur began to build again, emboldened by Marshall's righteous indignation. A woman's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "That man deserves an apology." Marshall nodded firmly, addressing Price once more. "Apologize to General Wills." Now, Price hesitated, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and defiance. He glanced at Wills, who stood silently, his steady gaze fixed on the officer. I'm sorry," Price mumbled, his voice barely audible. Louder, Marshall barked. "Let everyone hear it." Price swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry, General Wills. I made a mistake." The words hung in the air, a fragile acknowledgment of his wrongdoing. The crowd's collective silence was heavy, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Some nodded in approval, while others crossed their arms, skeptical of the officer's sincerity. Wills finally spoke, his voice measured and authoritative. "Lieutenant Marshall, thank you for stepping in. However, this incident highlights a deeper issue that goes beyond one apology." Marshall nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. "You're right, sir. And I assure you, this will be addressed at every level." He turned to Price. "You're suspended, effective immediately. There will be an investigation into your conduct. Report to the station now." Price's shoulders slumped as he nodded, retreating to his patrol car under the watchful eyes of the crowd. His departure felt like an unspoken acknowledgment of defeat, a stark contrast to the triumphant aura of the man he had wronged. As the crowd began to disperse, Marshall turned back to Wills. "General, I'm deeply sorry for what you've been through today. This never should have happened." Wills nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Your actions today restored a measure of faith, but there's still much work to be done." Marshall extended his hand, and Wills accepted it with a firm grip. Around them, a few onlookers clapped, their applause tentative but heartfelt. The moment felt like a small victory, though the underlying issues remained unresolved. As Wills returned to his vehicle, the weight of the day lingered in his chest. He had faced battles before, but this one felt different, a reminder of the fight still needed to ensure respect and equality for all. The road ahead was long, but as a general, he was no stranger to leading the charge. Lieutenant Paul Marshall's authoritative voice resonated in the tense silence as he stared down Officer Price. The crowd's reaction to his reprimand was immediate and visceral. Applause rippled through the gathering, signaling not only support for General Wills, but also a collective condemnation of the officer's actions. The energy shifted. What had begun as a scene of fear and outrage was transforming into one of solidarity and accountability. Price's face turned ashen, his shoulders slumping as the reality of his situation settled over him. He muttered an apology under his breath, barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "Louder," Marshall snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Say it so everyone can hear you." The disgraced officer's voice shook as he raised his head slightly, his words stumbling out more clearly. I'm sorry, General Wills. I made a mistake." The crowd murmured approvingly, their initial anger tempered by the visible shame on Price's face. A few onlookers even nodded in acknowledgment of his reluctant admission, though others remained skeptical of his sincerity. General Wills, standing tall despite the physical and emotional weight of the encounter, remained silent for a moment. His steady gaze rested on Price, who avoided his eyes. The crowd's attention shifted back to the general, their expressions expectant. "Apologies are a start," Wills finally said, his voice calm yet firm. "But they're not enough. True accountability comes from action, not just words. Officer Price, I hope you learn from this moment, not for my sake, but for the sake of everyone who deserves respect and fairness." The words hung heavy in the air, their weight undeniable. Price nodded weakly, his hands fidgeting at his sides, but he didn't respond. Marshall took a step forward, addressing the crowd with a solemn expression. "I want to assure everyone here that this incident will not be brushed aside. Officer Price is suspended, effective immediately, and there will be a thorough investigation. This department has no tolerance for misconduct or prejudice." The crowd's approval swelled again, some clapping while others called out their gratitude. "Thank you, Lieutenant," someone shouted, their voice cutting through the applause. Wills allowed himself a small nod of acknowledgement, but his thoughts were far from the noise around him. He glanced toward the onlookers, many of whom had captured the entire incident on their phones. This wasn't just about him. It was about the larger conversation this moment could ignite. "This isn't over," he said quietly to Marshall as the lieutenant turned back toward him. "But you handled it well. Thank you for stepping in." Marshall's expression softened, a hint of regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry it came to this, sir. You deserve better." The general extended his hand, and Marshall shook it firmly. The crowd's cheers reached a crescendo, their applause now filled with a sense of closure. As General Wills walked back to his vehicle, his head held high, the weight of the day lingered in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But in this moment, surrounded by a community that stood for what was right, he felt a spark of hope, a belief that change was possible, one act of accountability at a time. Lieutenant Paul Marshall's question hung in the air, drawing the attention of everyone gathered. "General Wills, do you wish to press charges?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with regret. General Thomas Wills stood in contemplative silence. His mind raced through the implications of his decision. He thought about those who had faced similar situations but lacked witnesses or a figure of authority willing to intervene. His own privilege in this moment, his rank, his medals, and the presence of a fair lieutenant, was undeniable. The memories of countless stories of injustice played in his mind, each one heavy with the weight of unfairness and tragedy. The crowd was hushed, their phones still recording, their collective breath held as they awaited his answer. Officer Price, standing to the side, looked visibly shaken. Relief flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by confusion and a lingering sense of dread. "No," Will said at last, his voice clear and deliberate. "I won't press charges." A ripple of shock swept through the onlookers. A few gasped audibly, while others exchanged incredulous glances. Even Marshall seemed momentarily stunned. Price's head jerked up, his face a mixture of disbelief and tentative gratitude. Wills raised a hand to quiet the murmuring crowd. His commanding presence demanded attention, and the silence returned as quickly as it had been broken. He turned to address both Price and the bystanders. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about what's broken in our system. Officer Price's actions were unacceptable, but pressing charges against him won't fix the deeper issues we face." Wills paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd leaned in, captivated by his composure and conviction. "Justice isn't just about punishment," he continued. "It's about change. If Officer Price can learn from this, if he can reflect on his actions and commit to being better, then that's the justice I want." Marshall's expression softened, a new layer of respect evident in his gaze. "You're a bigger man than most, General," he said quietly. The crowd, initially stunned, began to clap. The applause started slowly, hesitant at first, but quickly grew louder. People nodded in agreement, their admiration for Will's grace and wisdom evident. Price swallowed hard, his shame palpable. "Thank you, General," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do better. I promise." Wills didn't respond immediately. Instead, he locked eyes with Price, searching for sincerity. After a moment, he gave a single nod. "I hope you mean that," Will said firmly, "because this isn't just about you either. It's about every person who deserves respect and fairness, regardless of their rank, their uniform, or the color of their skin." Marshall stepped forward, addressing the crowd with authority. "Thank you all for bearing witness today. This incident is a reminder of the work we all have to do to ensure justice and accountability. Rest assured, Officer Price will face internal review and training to address his actions." The crowd's clapping grew louder, mixed with cheers of support for Wills. A few voices called out expressions of gratitude and admiration. "Thank you, General Wills," a woman's voice rang out. Wills turned to Marshall, his expression thoughtful. "Lieutenant, make sure that review is thorough," he said. "This moment can't be forgotten. It has to mean something." Marshall nodded solemnly. "I promise it will, sir." As the crowd began to disperse, Wills returned to his vehicle, his steps purposeful and steady. He opened the door but paused, looking back at the scene one last time. Price stood to the side, humbled and subdued, while Marshall coordinated the dispersal of the remaining onlookers. Wills climbed into his SUV, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. But as he drove away, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was slow and often painful, but it started with moments like this, moments where grace and accountability intersected to forge a better path forward. General Thomas Wills stood by his SUV, his uniform still dusted from the ordeal, as the crowd erupted in applause. Their cheers and clapping weren't just for him, but for what he represented: resilience, grace, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The sound resonated through the street, a powerful testament to how one man's calm and integrity could inspire a community. Nearby, Officer Daniel Price stood frozen, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. The weight of his actions bore down on him as Lieutenant Paul Marshall escorted him away. Price's steps were slow, his demeanor subdued. The crowd's applause wasn't for him, but he couldn't help but feel the collective gaze of disappointment and judgment. The incident didn't remain confined to that street. Within hours, videos taken by onlookers flooded social media, sparking heated debates and shedding light on systemic issues of prejudice and accountability. News outlets picked up the story, painting General Wills as a hero of a different kind, a symbol of grace under pressure and a beacon of hope for those fighting against injustice. His name became synonymous with courage and compassion, and his actions inspired discussions in city council meetings, schools, and community centers. Weeks later, a surprising message arrived for General Wills. It was from none other than Officer Price, requesting a private meeting. Wills, ever open to the possibility of change, agreed. The meeting took place in a small, unassuming office at the police precinct. Price entered, his posture uncertain but his face earnest. "Thank you for meeting with me, General," Price began, his voice quieter than Wills remembered. I've enrolled in bias training. I've also started attending community forums. I want to understand, and I want to do better." Wills studied the young officer for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But what he saw was a man humbled, someone willing to confront his flaws and grow. "That's a good start," Wills replied, his voice steady. "It takes courage to face yourself, to admit you were wrong, and to commit to change. We all have the power to change, Officer Price. What matters is what you do next." Price extended his hand, and Wills took it firmly. The handshake wasn't just a gesture of forgiveness, but a symbolic passing of responsibility. The ripple effects of the incident didn't end there. Inspired by Wills' actions, the local police department began implementing mandatory bias training and community engagement programs. Schools incorporated discussions about equality and accountability into their curricula. Grassroots organizations sprang up, rallying for broader reforms. For Wills, the day wasn't just about his own experience. It was about laying a foundation for a better future. As he drove past the street where the incident had occurred, now a quiet suburban road once more, he reflected on the journey still ahead. Change wasn't immediate, nor was it easy, but moments like these were steps forward. And for the community, the lesson was clear. Injustice thrives in silence, but progress begins when voices rise. Not in anger, but in unity. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments below. Share where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that highlight humanity's capacity for growth, redemption, and hope.